Imagine Dave and his mother will be talking a mile a minute tonight.
Yeah. Yeah. What time was she getting in?
3.
So what did we cover last time? Just in summary, just.
Well, when we talked on this video last, which was in the fall, and the flowers were blooming, and it was a beautiful autumn day, we sort of discussed our lives when we were young and when we met, and our very early days when we were first married, and then we moved from Edmonton to Calgary because Jack had changed jobs and left the RCMP and taken the job here in Calgary. And we moved to an apartment that was belonged to our friends, the Sorensens. They were on a holiday and we hadn't found a place to live yet, so we lived in their place. And it was right on 8th Avenue near Mawada Armories. And we stayed there until we found our own apartment, which was over on Kensington Road. And then I was pregnant, and John was born while we lived there on Kensington Road.
Okay.
When we last talked on this video, it was a beautiful autumn day. We were sitting out in the backyard, and the flowers were blooming, and it was a very nice setting. Now it's nearing Christmas, and we're just going to continue a little bit with what happened after we met and moved to Calgary and started to raise a family.
And when we did move to Calgary, I had a job with Cascade Drilling, and that was the reason for the move. And we found an apartment on Kensington Road at about 20th Street, and we stayed there over the first Christmas, and after Christmas in January of '53, well, John was born. And we stayed in this apartment for about a year or so, and they raised the rent on us, so we decided, well, it's time to move. And so we started looking for a house, and we found a house over in Killarney on 35th Street Southwest. And I always remember the day we first moved in. The house wasn't completely finished, but we had to move out of the apartment, so we moved in the house, and I always remember there was a large pile of sawdust in the center of the kitchen floor. However, that was the least of our worries. And what happened after that?
You're not going to the electric chair.
I was quite comfortable, actually.
That's the problem, you look too comfortable.
When we talked on this video before, I'm
Start
sorry.
Okay.
When we last talked on this video, it was fall, and it was a nice autumn day. We were sitting out in the backyard. Now it's near Christmas time, and we're going to continue a little bit about, oh, that's wrong. Let's start again. That's not what I meant to say.
Sure.
Can you start again?
Yep.
Also had a piece of fuzz in my mouth.
Okay.
When we talked on this video last time, it was an autumn day and we were sitting out in the backyard. Now it's December and we're sitting in the living room in front of the Christmas tree. We've covered a bit about our growing up and our life together before we had children, and now the big events in our lives are yet to come. Would you say that?
I think that's a good summation of it, and the most important part of our lives is when our children were born, and perhaps we should talk a little about that now and go on from there.
When you got married, was it a sort of in the forefront of your mind that you wanted to raise a family?
Definitely it was in my mind. That's because family had been the most important thing always in my life. You know, my own family, and then my brother's family, my sister's families. You know, that was just a way of life as far as I was concerned. And especially after the war, everyone was so glad to get back to a normal way of life, and you just wanted to settle down and have a home and try to get back to a normal way of living.
So when you guys had, obviously you talked about having kids, was it a big family what you wanted? Or I guess at that time, 5, 6 kids didn't really seem like a big family.
Well, I came from a fairly large family. I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and we always thought that our family would be the most important part of our lives. So we had planned on a fairly large family, and we're glad that's the way it worked out.
So when change here a little bit. So when you were first pregnant with John, did you? I know everybody now tries to decide whether they're having a boy or a girl.
Yes.
or what. So did you have any sort of premonitions about whether your first child was a boy or a girl? Or?
No, I'd never had any premonitions about whether the first girl would be a boy or a girl, or no strong desires, because having been a nurse, I realized that a lot of children didn't live when they were born. A lot of babies died, a lot of babies weren't well when they were born, and so the primary thing in my mind with every one of you was that you be healthy, and it wasn't a big issue in my mind whether it was a boy or a girl, and so we were delighted whichever one came along.
Mm-hmm. So what was it like when you were first pregnant with John? What was your pregnancy like, and what was your life like then?
Well, my life was easier because I wasn't working.
Sorry, maybe you start that when I was first pregnant with John.
Okay, sorry. When I was first pregnant with John, it was not a... Oh, now what am I going to say here?
Okay.
When I was first pregnant with John, or actually with any of the children, I was very well. I never was sick. I wasn't working out of the home, and with John, I was just thoroughly delighted because it was something I wanted to have. And at that time, of course, they didn't have the tests and so on to check whether it was a boy or a girl, and so it wasn't too much of an issue at that time.
Did you have any premonition about what it was going to be?
No, I never had any premonitions about what the baby would be.
Okay. What were you doing at the time, Dad? What was your work then?
Well, before John was born, I was working in an office on 8th Avenue Southwest. I had just joined this company, and I wasn't flying with them as yet. I was doing some office work, and it was just a very short drive from our apartment on Kensington to downtown on 8th Avenue. It took about 10 minutes to get there by car, and it was a big day on January the 12th when John was born of the following year, and as I recall, I took the rest of the day off.
What was John like as a baby?
John was a delightful little boy once he got over the colic. He had a bit of colic in the beginning, but he was very fat little face and a very healthy baby, and we were just thrilled to death with this little boy. And he was once he got over a few weeks of colic, he was a very good-natured little kid, and was not really very much trouble at all.
How was it, a family and had kids of your own, and did you have anybody close by then, or?
Okay, when John was born, of course it was here in Calgary, and Mom lived in Edmonton, but she was a widow, but then my father had died in '52. So she came down to help me over the first few weeks, and yes, he was a big event, we'll say that, because Jean's children were older, and Burgess's children were older, and Phyllis's, of course, were older than that. And so it was a huge event, and I guess me being the youngest in the family, it was quite a fun time. And we had a lot of close friends, and we got cards and telegrams and flowers from everybody that we knew, I think. Didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And at what point, when did you start thinking about raising a family and the environment that they should be in, and moving out to the country? Was that something that you talked about? Was that a sort of a plan that you'd always had, or?
Well, after John was born, we always had this idea in the back of our mind that we'd like to live in the country. Doreen spent a lot of her life on a farm, and I was born and raised out in the suburbs of Scarborough, Ontario, and quite often on a Sunday afternoon we'd take a drive and drive around to the different areas around Calgary to see what was available and what areas would be the best spot to look for an acreage. And we always came back to the west and southwest part of the city to look for acreages, because that seemed to be the area that seemed most suited for us.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then, how old was John when you knew you were pregnant again with Cam?
When I was pregnant with Cam, John was 6 months old, and we took our first vacation when John was just around that age, and we went down to Waterton, and I think probably that's why we named Cameron what we did, because we had had such a lovely time there at Cameron Lake in Waterton Lakes Park, and we were very, very happy, because it seemed a nice idea to have two children quite close together. And I was, we were both a little bit older, so it wasn't like we were just kids having children. I mean, we were quite delighted, but then we got to thinking, well, it'd be kind of nice to have a house and not just be in an apartment. So then we started looking.
Okay, I'll ask you, when did you start flying with Cascade? When did that become part of the job?
I started flying with Cascade Drilling. It was about a year after I started with them, so that would make that in late 1953, and we had an office downtown on 8th Avenue, and a small office out at the airport, and in the same building as we kept the aircraft. And at that time, most of the flying was north to the various drilling rigs throughout Alberta.
How did that work out with the Cam and John being so little when you were flying? How much of the time were you away from home?
When I was flying, I wasn't away from home to any great degree because I was just flying a light aircraft, and the flights were usually of 2 or 3 hour duration. Sometimes in the wintertime the flights became longer because some of the drills were located up in the Northwest Territories, and we'd have to spend maybe a week or two flying out of Fort Nelson, and in the wintertime we did spend a little more time away from home, and I was always glad to get back to Calgary.
Mm-hmm. Was the flying something that you had looked forward to when you started on with the company? Was that what your aim was at that time?
I don't think I would ever have started with Cascade Drilling if it hadn't been for the prospects of flying. It was understood that I would be flying with them, and this was the only job I was interested in at that time.
Mm-hmm. So, what the flights were with the executive of the oil company? Is that who you'd be transporting, or was it crews? Or?
My passengers, when I was flying with Cascade Drilling to start, it was mostly the crews flying in and out of a drilling rig, and quite often they'd be stuck for a spare part, and I would have to fly this spare part in because the rig was shut down. And in the summertime, of course, we operated on wheels, and in the wintertime we put skis on the Cessna aircraft.
Mm-hmm. Was there any time when you thought you may be away on a trip when any of the kids were getting close to being born?
Well, when I was flying, it was always a possibility that I might be away when one of the kids was born, and in fact it did happen once. I believe when Paul was born, I wasn't very far away. I was only up in Edmonton, but I was able to talk to Mom as soon as she came out of the delivery room from Edmonton.
So what was it like with Cam? Was the birth any different now that you're experienced that, I guess? Oops. Okay. I'm sorry that.
Okay. I didn't have any trouble with the birth of any of the children as far as trouble goes. Cam was a little bit smaller than some of the rest of you, but he was perfectly healthy, and I didn't have any trouble. The main problem was there was a shortage of beds that June, and there was 3 of us packed into one little room that was really not much bigger than a private room, and but we all got along fine. And once again, Mom came from Edmonton to look after John, and then consequently to look after Cam and I when we got out of the hospital. It was summer then, of course, the end of June, and it was very hot, and it was a bit uncomfortable. But, and again, Cam had quite a little bit of colic when he was first born. And then Dad Crawford and Norman came to visit shortly after we got out of hospital, so it was a little bit of a hectic summer there for a while. But everything got straightened around, and I'll say this for John's benefit, he didn't act up or demand too much attention. He was quite a good-natured kid, so it made it easier to look after a new baby. Mm-hmm. I'd always loved babies, so and I'd had lots of experience with my nieces and nephews, and so it didn't seem to be a onerous task, except it wasn't that great when Jack was away.